Thank you guys for joining us for today's APBP webinar. We're so glad that so many of you have joined us today. We'll begin in just a moment. To minimize distractions, we ask that you please continue to keep your microphones on mute and join with your cameras off. For the Q&A session at the end of the program, please enter your questions in the Q&A tool in Zoom, and our moderator will get to those in the designated time we have at the end of the session. Make plans to join us for the 2 remaining webinars this year listed on the slide. APBP members can purchase the bundle packages or individual webinars for a discounted rate. Visit apbp.org/webinars for more details. Our 2024 webinar series will be announced later this year, so stay tuned for more information on that. And before we begin, I'd like to recognize and thank all of our sponsors of the 2023 APBP webinar program. These generous supporters help to make the webinar program happen, and we truly appreciate their continued support. And again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, What's Next for PROWAG? Before we get started, I'd like to welcome APBP past chair and webinar committee member, Marianne Coos. Marianne will be introducing our speakers for today's session and moderating the Q&A portion at the end. Welcome, Marianne. Marianne, if you don't mind to unmute.
Okay. It's working now. It wouldn't let me unmute myself before. So hi, thank you, everybody. What we'd like to do, we've reserved an hour and a half for this webinar because we just felt there was so much content and we wanted to leave you enough time for questions. And so we're going to have like about an hour of presentation materials and then a half an hour of questions at the end. And Autumn, can you forward the slide to the introductions and I'll introduce the speakers? Okay, so our first speaker is Juliet Shoultz. And Juliet joined the Access Board's Office of Technical and Information Services in 2017 as a transportation systems engineer. She has 15 years of experience in transportation planning and engineering for state government. And prior to working at the Access Board, she worked as the ADA policy engineer at the Illinois Department of Transportation. She led development and implementation of the department's ADA transition plan and served as the department's accessibility expert, which gives you so much practical experience. This is just such a great background, providing technical assistance and reviewing plans for state projects. She previously served as a member of the Illinois Accessibility Code Revision Committee, which was tasked with revising the Illinois Accessibility Code. And Shoultz has been an active participant as a member of NCHRP panels and Transportation Research Board standing meetings. So welcome, Juliet, and we'll introduce Elizabeth real quick. So Elizabeth Hilton is a PE with the Federal Highway Geometric Design Program. She's the manager, and she provides expertise in the program areas of geometric design, design for individuals with disabilities, bicycle and pedestrian accommodations, context-sensitive, and performance-based practical design. And so she serves as the FHWA liaison to the AASHTO Technical Committee on Geometric Design. And prior to joining FHWA, she worked with the Texas DOT, where she served as a member of the U.S. Access Board's Public Rights-of-Way Access Advisory Committee. And thank you, Elizabeth and Juliet, both for joining us. And we're going to start with Juliet, and then we'll move on to Elizabeth. And so if you're thinking about answering questions as the presentation goes through, please try to keep your questions broad. We can't answer project-specific questions, but broad questions that would benefit everyone are very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. I'll go ahead and share my slides. Okay. So like Marianne mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, PROWAG. Specifically, what I'm going to address today in the limited time we have, I'm going to talk about changes in alteration, alternate pedestrian access routes, pedestrian push buttons, passive pedestrian detection, and accessible pedestrian signal walk indications, curb ramps and crosswalks, parking and passenger loading zones, and I'll also touch on some other changes to the rule. I want you to keep in mind there have been a lot of changes, revisions, clarifications to the rule. And so if you really want an in-depth coverage of the new PROWAG, I'd recommend looking at the 5 YouTube videos. And at the end of the presentation, there'll be a QR code where you can access those videos. And of course, you can always send us questions if you need clarification on any of the new requirements. So I'll go ahead and get started with alterations. One thing we did, and I guess just in general, in terms of the changes we've made, a lot of them were informed by the comments that we received from the 2013 draft, which was the latest one we had out there. And then some changes were informed by technical assistance questions that we get over time. So that helped us identify areas where we needed to clarify what the requirement was in the rule text. We also no longer have references to the MUTCD, so you'll see a lot of the requirements from the MUTCD directly in the rule text. There is one area where we deviate from the MUTCD, and I'll point that out. And then also another thing we did is for consistency with ADAG, the ADA accessibility guidelines for buildings and sites, which a lot of people are familiar with, we also made sure our language was consistent. So that's kind of where a lot of these changes came about. So with alterations, there were a lot of questions that we got in technical assistance about what is an alteration versus new construction and what's required. So in the final rule, we made sure to clarify the difference between the two, whether you're doing an alteration or whether you're doing new construction. So as shown in the slide, we did define alteration, and that's a change to or an addition of a pedestrian facility in an existing developed public right-of-way that affects or could affect pedestrian access, circulation, or usability. And we also defined developed, which is containing buildings, pedestrian facilities, roadways, utilities, or elements. So the two pictures on the slide, one of them is clearly an alteration that you have existing roadway and other buildings and facilities. And on the right-hand side, you have greenfield. There's absolutely nothing there. And so that would be new construction. And most of the work you're going to be doing is going to fall under alterations. Another change that you'll notice is the provision in the draft that we use to term equivalent facilitation. So equivalent facilitation is still allowed for Title II or Title III entities. But what we did here is we split it up into two sub-provisions. And the reason is depending on whether you're doing work for an ADA covered facility, which is your towns and counties and states, Title II agencies. So those are covered under the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, versus if you're doing work on a federal site, which are covered by the Architectural Barriers Act. And so these two sub-provisions point out what you need to do if you must deviate from these requirements. So under the ADA, use of alternative designs, products, or technologies that result in substantially equivalent or greater accessibility and usability than the proposed guidelines is permitted. And we don't have a process in place for you to identify why you are deviating from these guidelines. Now, if you are working at a facility, let's say a military base that's under the Architectural Barriers Act, if you needed to deviate from these guidelines, you'd need to get an approved waiver or modification, and that would be issued by the standard setting agency. So if you're working on a military base, for example, you'd have to reach out to DoD, Department of Defense, to get a waiver or a modification to deviate from the guidelines. So that's really the difference. The deviation is still recognized. Sometimes you might have to do that, but it's a difference in how that process works. Another change we made is on the provision about existing physical constraints. So for consistency with ADAG, we removed the language, make it impracticable. ADAG uses technically infeasible. So you won't see that terminology, make it impracticable like terminology. You will not see that in final rule. Instead, you'll see technically infeasible. So that's one change that I highlighted on this slide. The other key change that we made is we got rid of the right-of-way availability as an example of existing physical constraints. So in the NPRM, in that provision, we had a listing of examples of physical constraints, and right-of-way availability was one of them. But what we found was that that was really confusing because right-of-way availability was interpreted in multiple different ways by users. One was, is there not land at all? You're in a tight space, maybe in an urban area, so the sidewalk abuts to the building and you can't make the sidewalk wider, for example. Or is it right-of-way availability in that you need to get an easement or something along those lines? So there are different interpretations by users on what right-of-way availability is. And because on a lot of projects, you can get an easement, you can get the right-of-way, we decided to remove that as an example, and so that each project can be assessed on depending on what the parameters are and what the availability is and whether that right-of-way can be acquired. So now we're going to go into some of the more technical requirements. In R202.2, we state that where pedestrian facilities are altered, they shall be connected by a pedestrian access route complying with R302. R302 is our technical requirements for a pedestrian access route or a PAR. And so a transition segment may also be used to make this connection. An example of this is if you have a project where, let's say you are just redoing the curb ramps and landing, but you're not doing the rest of the sidewalk. This requires that when you redo that curb ramp and your landing, you tie into the existing, which may not be compliant, but you tie in with a pedestrian access route or a transition segment. Another thing you'll notice in the final rule is we used to have transitional segment as a provision. What we've done now is we've defined transitional segment, and then we use the language within the rule text. But the concept of a transitional segment has not changed. I mentioned R302 includes the technical requirements for a pedestrian access route or a PAR. So we'll look at some of them. I won't address all of them, but I just want to point out the ones where we revised for clarity or we changed the requirement substantively. First thing is continuous clear width. This requirement didn't change, but we just wanted to make clear that when we say 48 inches minimum, that excludes the width of any curb. So you can see in this, on this image on the slide, I'm showing the width of the pedestrian access route, but that doesn't include the width of the curb. So you want to make sure you have 48 inches exclusive of that width of the curb. The 48 inches, that's the minimum pedestrian access route width, unless you are in medians and pedestrian refuge island. There we require 60 inches minimum. Where you have shared use paths that are crossing medians and pedestrian refuge island, the requirement is you have 60 inches minimum, or at least as wide as the crosswalk, whichever is greater. And keep in mind on a shared use path, PROWAG still doesn't tell you how wide your shared use path must be, but the entire width of pedestrian circulation must be accessible. The grade of the pedestrian access route within the highway right-of-way. That requirement hasn't changed, but we just wanted to clarify what that means. So on this picture, I'm showing a roadway that has a pretty steep grade, probably well over 5%. And so what we are requiring, which is consistent with what we had in the draft rule, is that the sidewalk within that right-of-way can match the grade of the road. What we do clarify is that just because that sidewalk happens to exceed 5%, that does not then make it a ramp requiring the ramp requirements, which would be, you know, the handrail, the edge protection, and all that. So the sidewalk adjacent to a steep roadway is allowed to exceed 5%, but that does not then make it a ramp. We also added an exception. So the grade of a pedestrian access route within a crosswalk, so that's the grade measured in the direction of travel, is 5% maximum, except where your roadway design requires super elevation, which would make that crosswalk greater than 5% if the crosswalk is located where you have that super elevation. So the grade of the pedestrian access route within the crosswalk would be allowed to be the same as the super elevation. The cross slope of a pedestrian access route not contained within a crosswalk. So that's measured perpendicular to the direction of travel, as indicated on the slide, is 2.1% maximum. So you'll notice we have 2.1% in the final rule text. We're presenting slopes in both ratios. So in this case, 1 in 48, and in percentages, 2.1%, which is the equivalent for 1 in 48. We did that in part to be consistent with ADAG. In ADAG, the slopes are represented as ratios. And so for consistency, we did the same thing in PROWAG, where we have them as ratios with their equivalent percentage. We do have an exception for cross slopes of a pedestrian access route, and that's when your pedestrian access route is within the vehicular way. So on this slide, you have on-street parking. And remember, in PROWAG, we require that if you cannot provide an access aisle or a parking space large enough to have that access aisle, you should provide it at the end of the block face or mid-block where there's a crosswalk, so the driver can get out of the car and have easy access to the crosswalk. Well, understandably, that pedestrian access route from the car to the crosswalk, it's in the middle of the roadway, so it's not required to meet the 2.1% cross slope. It will match whatever slope is in the roadway. So that's the other exception. On this slide, I'm showing the cross slope of a pedestrian access route contained within a crosswalk. So that's going to depend on where the crosswalk is located. Nothing's changed here from the draft rule text, but we did clarify a few things. With yield or stop control devices, if that's the traffic control you have at the intersection, those crosswalks can have a cross slope up to 2.1%. At an uncontrolled approach, you can have a cross slope up to 5.0%. Where you have traffic control signal or pedestrian hybrid beacon, again, you're restricted to 5.0%. And then if your crosswalk is at mid-block or at a roundabout, the cross slope is allowed to match the grade of the street. Keep these in mind when you're looking at your curb ramps, because the curb ramps that are adjoined to these crosswalks also get allowed to have the same cross slope. So for example, if you have a mid-block curb ramp, you have a mid-block crosswalk and you have a curb ramp that's adjoined to that, that mid-block crosswalk is allowed to have a cross slope that matches the grade of the street. And so the curb ramp as well would be allowed the same cross slope. Grade breaks must be flush. That's still the same requirement as we had in the rule text, in the draft rule text. One thing we changed is the terminology for what we used to refer to as vertical surface discontinuities. In the draft text, we had that language. We've now changed it to changes in level. It means the exact same thing, but this is another case where we wanted to be consistent with ADAG, and ADAG uses the language changes in level. So same requirement, it's just we changed the terminology. Changes in level can be up to 1/4 inch, no treatment required, or 1/2 inch if they're beveled with a slope that's no steeper than 1 in 2 or 50%. Changes in level that are greater than 1/2 inch up to 6 inches must have a slope no greater than 1 in 12 or 8.3%. Now, if your change in level is greater than 6 inches, now you're looking at a ramp, and you need to comply with the ramp requirements, which are in R407. In 309.1.3.2, we talk about connecting boarding and alighting areas and boarding platforms to existing pedestrian circulation paths. So in alterations, boarding and alighting areas and boarding platforms need to be connected to existing pedestrian circulation paths by pedestrian access routes complying with R302. Remember, R302 gives you the technical requirements for a pedestrian access route. And so what this looks like, for example, if you add a bus stop and maybe you put it in the middle of the block somewhere and you don't have a sidewalk that gets you all the way to the bus stop. So it's not connected to the intersection. Maybe the sidewalk starts at the intersection and it comes, shy of mid-block. So this requirement is you have an alteration. You've either altered the bus stop or you've added a new bus stop. What this requires is you provide a pedestrian access route that connects to the existing pedestrian circulation path. So it's not telling you that you need to reconstruct the existing sidewalk if it's not accessible. What it's saying is that when you add that bus stop or modify that bus stop, the boarding and alighting areas or the boarding platform, you need to connect it to the existing pedestrian circulation path, existing sidewalk, by a pedestrian access route. We have a requirement for alternate passenger loading zones, and this was really more of a clarification, where permanently designated passenger loading zones are temporarily not accessible due to construction, maintenance, or other similar conditions, and you provide a temporary passenger loading zone, that temporary passenger loading zone needs to be accessible. In other words, meet the requirements are in R311. For alternate transit stops, where accessible transit stops are temporarily not accessible due to construction, maintenance, operations, or other similar conditions, alternate transit stops complying with R309, which is the technical requirements for transit stops, must be provided. So again, you have, let's say, a bus boarding and alighting area at a bus stop that is accessible, and you have to close it down for whatever reason, maintenance, reconstruction. The requirement is you provide an alternate transit stop that's also accessible. And there's different ways in which this could look. If it's at an intersection, maybe it makes sense to just make the alternate transit stop one of the accessible ones across the street, if it makes sense for the way the bus route works. But the key thing here is if you are making an accessible transit stop temporarily unavailable, you need to make sure you provide an alternate transit stop that's also accessible. So now we'll talk about alternate pedestrian access routes, which you'll have a lot of if you're doing alteration projects and closing up pedestrian circulation paths. So when a pedestrian circulation path is temporarily not accessible due to construction, maintenance, closure, or other similar conditions, what we require is an alternate pedestrian access route be provided. Consistent with R303, and R303 is going to spell out all the requirements for an alternate pedestrian access route. There is an exception if establishing or maintaining an alternate pedestrian access route is technically infeasible due to site conditions or existing physical constraints. An alternate means of providing access for pedestrians with disabilities shall be permitted. So you might need an alternate means if, let's say, you are, redoing a pedestrian bridge or something along those lines. The key thing to remember is this alternate means really needs to provide equivalent facilitation. It shouldn't be a shuttle that someone has to call when they get on the site. So it really needs to, they need to have the same level of use as someone who maybe can take the stairs as an alternate route. So you need to really think through if you are providing an alternate means for pedestrians to get around that construction. I mentioned R303 has all the requirements for alternate pedestrian access routes. In the draft rule text, we refer to MUTCD, and you'll find that a lot of these requirements are pretty consistent to what we were referencing in the MUTCD. First, with signs, you need to have signs identifying the alternate pedestrian access routes, and they need to be provided in advance of decision points and comply with R410. R410 gives us the requirements for accessible signs. One thing to keep in mind is proximity actuated audible signs or other non-visual means within the public right-of-way of conveying the information that identifies the alternate pedestrian access route must also be provided. So basically, you need to provide signage if you're providing an alternate pedestrian access route, but that signage needs to be accessible. So if it's just a sign, for example, as you see here on the slide, someone with no vision or low vision doesn't know that there is a sign there. And that's where the requirement for proximity actuated audible signs or other non-visual means comes in. I mentioned your signage needs to comply with R410, and just highlighting on this slide, R410 covers things like finish and contrast of the signage, the case, style of the font, character, proportions, character height. So I won't go through all these requirements for signage, but they are in R410. So the alternate pedestrian access route, what's required to make sure that it meets PROWAG requirements? Surfaces must comply with R302.6. Remember, R302.6 addresses pedestrian access routes. So we're talking your grade breaks, changes in level, horizontal openings, and so on. Or that alternate pedestrian access route needs to be no less accessible than the surface of the temporarily closed pedestrian circulation path. And this is consistent with what we were referencing in MUTCD in the draft rule text. The continuous clear width of that alternate pedestrian access route should be 48 inches minimum, again, exclusive of the width of any curb. There is an exception where the alternate pedestrian access route utilizes an existing pedestrian circulation path. The width must be no less than the width of the temporarily closed pedestrian circulation path. So I want to talk about this exception where you're allowed to have the width no less than the width of the temporary closed pedestrian circulation path. And also on the previous slide where I said the alternate pedestrian access route must comply with R302.6, but be no less accessible than the surface of the temporarily closed pedestrian circulation path. What this looks like is, for example, if you're doing, if you're replacing sidewalk, let's say, on both sides of a street, you know, one block, for example, and on both sides, the sidewalk is deteriorated, and maybe on both sides, it's less than 48 inches. Maybe it's that 36-inch wide sidewalk. This allows that you can detour, you can have your alternate pedestrian access route on the sidewalk across the street, even though it's not fully compliant. It's not 48 inches wide, but it's at least as accessible as what you're closing off. That way you can, you know, redo the one side of the road, redo that sidewalk, and detour to the other side, which, you know, is no less accessible than what's closed off. So that's really what that allows you to do, which is consistent with what we reference in MUTCD. You do need to keep in mind that where the alternate pedestrian access route crosses a curb, you do have to provide a curb ramp or blended transition. So if you were missing curb ramps across the street, those you do have to provide. Where a channelizing device is used to delineate an alternate pedestrian access route, it needs to be continuous detectable edging throughout the entire length of the route. Of course, there is exception for where construction vehicles are coming in and out of the construction zone, or where vehicles turn. So in those areas, you can have a gap in that detectable edging, but other than that, you need to have it continuously throughout the length of that accessible route. And then we also included the technical requirements for detectable edging, again from MUTCD. So these will look familiar to you if you're familiar with the MUTCD. The top of the detectable edging must be no lower than 32 inches above the walking surface and be free of sharp or abrasive surfaces. The bottom of the bottom detectable edging must be 2 inches maximum above the walking surface. Where temporary pedestrian signs are provided on the alternate pedestrian access route, for example, at a crosswalk, they need to be accessible. So your pedestrian push buttons, your passive detection devices, any temporary pedestrian signal heads you're providing on that alternate pedestrian access route needs to be accessible. In other words, comply with R307. Which leads us to the next section where we're going to talk about pedestrian push buttons, passive pedestrian detection, and accessible pedestrian signal lock indications. So where provided, pedestrian signal heads and pedestrian activated warning devices, such as rectangular rapid flashing beacons, must comply with R206. So this is your scoping. The accessible features required by these guidelines must be available at all times. So where you have traffic control signals and hybrid beacons with PED signal heads, you need to have walk indication that's compliant with R308. You need to, pedestrian signals must have a pedestrian push button that's compliant with the requirements, or passive detection or pre-timed operation that activates both the audible and vibrotactile indications. If you have pedestrian activated warning devices like rectangular rapid flashing beacons, same thing, you need to have either pedestrian push buttons that's compliant or passive detection that operates audible indications. Push button operations, operable parts must be compliant with Chapter 4. The PED push buttons, or if you're using passive detection devices, they need to activate accessible pedestrian signals and, where applicable, the walk interval. If you have extended push button press, we do have some requirements. A push button press of less than a second activates only the PED timing and any associated accessible walk indications. A push button press greater than a second must actuate the PED timing, any associated accessible walk indications, and any other additional features that you might provide. If additional crossing time is provided by means of an extended push button press, you need to have a sign mounted adjacent to or integral to the pedestrian push button indicating that you do have these additional features. Push button should be oriented parallel to the associated crosswalk, as you can see in this picture here. And PED push buttons must have a tactile arrow with high visual contrast. So you can see the light on dark, dark on light with a tactile arrow. And it too must be aligned parallel to the direction of travel of the associated crosswalk. The PED push buttons must be operable with one hand and shouldn't require grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist, and shouldn't require more than 5-pound force to operate. You need to provide a clear space that's at least 30 by 48. We did make some clarifications on the clear space. So the maximum clear space slope is 1 in 48 or 2.1% in both directions. Now, remember I talked about the cross slope requirements at the crosswalk and how those would also apply to the adjoining curb ramps. So we have an exception here. The slope may be consistent with the slope of the adjacent pedestrian access route if that adjacent pedestrian access route conforms to the requirements of R302.4. And again, R302.4 gave you that cross slope requirements at crosswalks, depending on whether it was at a yield and stop controlled or stop controlled intersection or signalized or mid block. So you get that exception there. They may be positioned, that clear space can be positioned for either a forward or parallel approach. but we made sure to clarify this is something we got a lot in technical assistance. Clear spaces should not be located on curb ramp runs or flares. Where two pedestrian push buttons are provided on the same corner, they must be separated by 10 feet. There is an exception in alterations where it's technically feasible to provide that 10-foot separation. So where that's the case, a pedestrian push button information message must be provided. And let's talk about the speech information message when walk interval is not timing. So where your speech push button information messages are made available are either pre-timed signals or by actuating them. The accessible pedestrian push button or the passive detection device, they must only be actuated when the walk interval is not timing. And they need to begin with, again, this is consistent with MUTCD, they need to begin with the term wait, followed by the intersection identification, for example, wait to cross Broadway at Grand. If information on intersection signalization or geometry is also provided, it needs to come after the speech information, for example, wait to cross Broadway at Grand. So the additional information would come after that. Then we have speech walk messages that are used. So at intersections having pedestrian phasing that is concurrent with vehicular phasing. And again, all of this is consistent with MUTCD. It would be modeled after Broadway. Walk sign is on to cross Broadway. If you have speech walk messages that are used at intersections that have exclusive pedestrian phasing, those need to be modeled after walk. Signal is on for all crossing. If you provide a pilot light at an accessible pedestrian signal location, each actuation needs to be accompanied by the speech message wait. So that allows for that audible function or audible information that someone who's blind will not be able to have with just a pilot light that doesn't provide any audible feedback. Where your accessible ped signal is provided at a single crossing, or where you have two accessible pedestrian signals that are 10 feet or greater from each other at a corner, the audible walk indication must be a percussive tone. So remember, when they were less than 10 feet apart, we just talked about the speech information message and what that should look like so that someone knows has clear information about which button they're pressing and what information, what it's going to give them, which crosswalk access it's going to give them. But when the accessible pedestrian signals are 10 feet or greater at the corner, then the audible walk indication needs to be a percussive tone. And we have technically how that should work in terms of how often it should repeat. We also have information in the volume, and all that is consistent with MUTCD. Pedestrian push buttons or passive detection devices need to activate both the audible and vibrotactile walk indications. And the pedestrian push button needs to vibrate during that walk interval. Okay, so that's where you have walk indications for pedestrians, where you're providing pedestrian signal heads. Where pedestrian push button or passive detection is provided for pedestrian activated warning devices, such as rectangular rapid flashing beacons, the PED push button or passive detection device needs to activate a speech message that indicates the status of the beacon instead of the audible walk indication. So this is important because what we want is to make sure, like, people with, in this case, who are low vision or blind are getting the exact same information as people who are sighted. So at an RRFB, you don't get the information that it is now safe to walk. You don't get a green light that tells you that you can now walk. You're really just getting the information to the vehicles that these pedestrians about to get into the crosswalk, so that the speech message that either the push button or passive detection device gives, that speech message needs to indicate the status of the beacon instead of an audible walk indication. Where a pedestrian push button is provided, it should not include vibrotactile features indicating a walk interval. Again, at an intersection where there's a walk interval, you want the information telling the pedestrian to walk, the audible information, and the ped push button vibrotactile function should be working during the walk interval. But where you have pedestrian activated warning devices, you don't want that vibrotactile feature working, because that's not truly a walk interval. It's more, again, it's giving the drivers information about pedestrians possibly coming into the crosswalk. It's not giving pedestrians information that it is now safe for you to walk. Pedestrian push buttons must incorporate a locator tone, and it needs to be active the entire time. The duration is consistent with MUTCD. There is an exception, of course. A locator tone may be silenced if a passive detection system activates the locator tone, but it needs to be activated when a pedestrian is within a 12-foot radius of that ped push button. This is an area where we deviate from the MUTCD. So when the traffic control signal is operating in flashing mode, the pedestrian push button locator tones must remain active. And the pedestrian push button must activate a speech message that communicates the operating mode of the traffic control signal. And again, most everything we've been consistent with what we were referencing in the MUTCD, but this is an area where we felt it was important that when someone who's blind or has low vision approaches an intersection where the traffic control is in flashing mode, that they have the same information that a sighted pedestrian would have. We did remove this provision from the rule text. In the NPRM, we had alterations. Existing pedestrian signals shall comply with R209.1 when the signal controller and software are altered or the signal head is replaced. So we were stating that if you do any of those things, then the existing pedestrian signal needs to then be an accessible pedestrian signal. APS during alterations will be determined according to the requirements and the guidelines as adopted by the enforcing agencies. So once the enforcing agencies adopt, they will provide some guidance on what alterations would trigger the requirement to make sure you have accessible pedestrian signals. Let's switch to curb ramps and crosswalks. Again, just talking about the changes, not all the technical requirements for curb ramps and crosswalks. We clarified when a change in direction is required at a perpendicular curb ramp, when a landing is required, sorry. So we did get a lot of TA questions where we had designers having perpendicular curb ramps and a landing. Based on the way we'd written the text, it kind of led you in that direction. But that landing is really only required when there's a change in direction is necessary. So on this slide, you have a perpendicular curb ramp, and then you have a landing because you have two ways you can go. You can turn left or right. So you need that landing as kind of a turning space to orient either to continue on the sidewalk or to get from the sidewalk to the curb ramp. If you didn't have a change in direction, so you'd have the curb ramp and the sidewalk just continues in one direction, you wouldn't need a landing at the top of that curb ramp. So we wanted to make sure we clarified that. It needs to be 48 by 48 inches wide. And another thing, for consistency, again, with ADAD, you will not see the terminology of turning space, which we used in draft rule text. We've replaced that with landing. It's essentially the same thing, but just for consistency with ADAD, we wanted to make sure we're using the same terminology. So what used to be turning spaces are now referred to as landings. In the draft rule text, we used to have under common requirements for curb ramps and blended transition, we had this clear space requirement, right? Beyond the bottom grade break, a clear space should be provided within the width of the pedestrian street crossing and wholly outside the parallel vehicular travel lane. In the final rule, we've clarified that that clear space is really only required at perpendicular curb ramps. Because when you think about the parallel curb ramps, you do have that, what would be a clear area, which would be the landing at the bottom of the perpendicular curb ramp. So again, that clear space is only required at perpendicular curb ramps. And we have added explicit technical requirements for that clear area, which we didn't have in the draft rule. We've specified that it must be at least 48 by 48, unless it's at a shared use path, in which case it needs to be as wide as the shared use path. It still needs to be located wholly outside the vehicle travel lanes, and we've clarified that that includes bike lanes, and those are the lanes that are running parallel to the crosswalk. The running slope 5% maximum, cross slope as specified in R302. Remember again, that cross slope and the crosswalk, if the crosswalk is allowed to have a 5% cross slope, then the clear space would also get that 5% cross slope allowance. We've clarified that at blended transition, where blended transition serving more than one pedestrian circulation path has a running slope greater than 2.1%, a pedestrian access route must be provided so that a pedestrian who's not crossing the street, they're just continuing around the corner, they have a pedestrian access route to bypass this blended transition. We clarified requirements for crosswalks at intersections, mid-block, and roundabouts, and where curb ramps are required or a blended transition. So crosswalks at an intersection, one curb ramp or blended transition must be provided for each crosswalk, or a single blended transition that spans all the crosswalks at the intersection corner. I do want to point out here that we did define crosswalk. And it was important to do that because that's another issue, that there was a lot of confusion surrounding what a crosswalk is. There was some misinterpretation that if the pavement isn't marked for a crosswalk, then you don't have a crosswalk, which isn't technically correct. So in our definition section, you will find that we have defined crosswalk consistent with MUTCD. I think we have a slight modification. Maybe the last sentence would clarify that pavement marking doesn't define the crosswalk. So even in the absence of the crosswalk pavement marking, you still have a crosswalk if it meets that definition. In alterations, a single curb ramp is permitted at the apex of the intersection corner. At mid-block and roundabout crosswalks, again, same requirement, you need to have curb ramp or blended transition at both ends of that crosswalk. We also clarified, which this was an area of confusion and we got a lot of questions about it, what happens when crossing is prohibited? So you can't just design an intersection where there isn't a curb ramp, on the other side and just say, well, we really don't want people to go there. You have to be intentional about that design. So if by definition you have a crosswalk, but crossing is prohibited, you need to be intentional about how you design that. And there's two ways to do that. So you either need to separate the curb ramp or blended transition from the roadway with landscaping or other non-prepared surface. So such as the picture on the left. You have sidewalk coming on both ends, but you do not want crossing across this main line at this intersection. So in this picture, they've separated the roadway with landscaping. Okay, so either landscaping or other non-prepared surface. The other option is vertical separation. So what we require is something that is detectable. So it should be cane detectable, which means it needs that vertical edge treatment needs to have a bottom edge 15 inches maximum above the pedestrian circulation path. So those are the two options you have. It doesn't have to be landscaping, but it's got to be a non-prepared surface. It cannot be detectable warning surfaces. Those really don't serve that purpose. We added some options for crosswalk treatments at roundabouts and channelized turn lanes. So at roundabouts, each multi-lane segment of the roundabout containing a crosswalk must provide a crosswalk treatment consisting of one or more of the following. So you get a choice between a traffic control signal with a PED signal head, a pedestrian hybrid beacon, a pedestrian actuated rectangular rapid flashing beacon, or a raised crossing. And you get the same options where you have crosswalks at multi-lane channelized turn lanes. You have the same options for the treatments. The traffic control signal with pedestrian signal head, pedestrian hybrid beacon, pedestrian actuated rectangular rapid flashing beacon, or a raised crossing. At roundabouts, we do require edge detection, and that's required on the street side edge of the pedestrian circulation path at the approach and along the circulatory roadway of the roundabout where crossing is not intended. And so in this image, they're using both separation with a non-prepared surface, and they're also using the vertical edge treatment. They didn't really need to do this at this roundabout specifically. So where the pedestrian circulation path is not attached to the curb, just like this roundabout, the pedestrian circulation path is not attached to the curb, landscaping or other non-prepared surface is required. So that was sufficient. They didn't need to have the vertical edge treatment. Now, if you have curb attached pedestrian circulation path, then you need to provide vertical edge treatment. It needs to be continuous and detectable, and the bottom edge must be no more than 15 inches above the pedestrian circulation path. And now we'll switch to parking and passenger loading zones, and I'll talk about the changes there. In terms of scoping, we still have the same requirements where on-street parking is provided, it is metered or designated by signs or pavement markings. Accessible parking spaces are required. We clarified some exceptions. If you have on-street parking spaces that are designated exclusively as residential parking, those are not covered by PROWAG. So you don't have to include those in determining how many accessible spaces you need. If you have on-street parking spaces designated exclusively for commercial or law enforcement, again, you don't have to include those in determining how many accessible parking spaces are required. And then the last exception we had in the draft rule text, where you alter the on-street parking spaces, the scoping requirements apply only to the affected parking spaces until you've met that minimum number of accessible on-street parking spaces that are required per table R211. One change you'll notice is we now specify the dimensions of on-street parallel parking spaces. And we say that they need to be at least 24 feet long by 13 feet wide. And of course, they should not encroach on the traveled way. So we don't have what we were defining as the access aisle, but in the dimensions that we provide, we're still accounting for that access aisle. We're just not calling it that anymore. We are requiring this space with the specific dimensions. And if you can't provide a space with these dimensions, that's when you go to the option of providing it at the end of the block face or at mid-block where you have that crosswalk. And in the NPRM, we'd only specify the dimensions of the access aisle. So the space for the access aisle still exists. It's just not clarified. It's not specified in final rule text. So you don't have to stripe, 5 feet wide of that space to discourage parking in it. One thing we found is people are getting ticketed for parking in the access aisle, but people with mobility disabilities use different devices, walkers, power wheelchairs, manual wheelchairs, and so they deploy out of their vehicles in different ways. And for some people, maybe they deploy on the driver's side, some deploy on the passenger side. So having this large space without the limitation of not being able to park in that access aisle because it's striped and marked as such to discourage parking allows for a user to make use of that space in the way that works best for them. Same exceptions that we had in the draft rule text, they're just stated a little differently. In the draft rule, we talked about alterations as a provision on its own, where the street or sidewalk adjacent to parking spaces is not altered, and access aisles should not be required, provided the parking spaces are located at the end of the block face. We still have the same exception, except now it's an exception to the dimensions. So same concept, just stated differently. And again, we talked about in the draft rule about where you have narrow sidewalk, you don't have the right of way to provide that access aisle. In the final rule, is basically if you can't meet those dimensions. So that's another, it's not a change, it's just we've structured the requirement differently, but the requirement is still the same. Parallel parking spaces need to connect to a pedestrian access route. If you have two or more accessible parallel on-street parking spaces, they need to each have their own access to or connection to the pedestrian access route. So if you have, adjacent parallel on-street parallel parking spaces, one shouldn't have to go through the adjacent space to get to the sidewalk. So you need to have a connection to the pedestrian access route, an independent connection for each on-street parallel parking space. For angled on-street parking space, in the draft rule, we specified the width of the access aisle, and we allowed that two angled on-street parking spaces can share an aisle. So what we've changed in final rule is we've specified the width of the angled parking space. And we also made clear that each angled on-street parking space shall have an adjacent access aisle, so they cannot share an access aisle anymore. And this in practice makes it really more accessible, because with angled on-street parking spaces, you generally can only go in one way, just forward. So when we allow the sharing of an access aisle, if you exit your vehicle from the passenger side, for example, you're hoping you'll find the space that has the access aisle on the passenger side available. So when we remove the sharing of the access aisle, whatever angled accessible on-street parking space is available will have its own designated access aisle for you to use. This is a requirement for clearance adjacent to parallel parking spaces. And it's not really new, but we discussed this in an advisory in the draft rule text. And the requirement is that the center 50% of the length of sidewalk or other surface adjacent to an accessible parallel parking space needs to be free of obstructions, and that includes your parking identification signs, parking pay meters, parking pay stations. So basically the center 50% needs to be completely clear. Again, this provides better use, greater access for this accessible on-street parking space, depending on how one exits their vehicle, whether it's on the passenger side or driver's side. Keeping this place clear allows for ramp deployment, lift deployment, just gives that extra space. So keep that in mind, that space needs to be clear. And we discussed it in advisory, but it's now explicitly stated in a provision. We did get rid of advisories. I forgot to mention that. So you will not see advisories anymore. Advisories, sometimes we found they could be helpful, but then sometimes they were taken as the requirement. So we've gotten rid of advisories, and what we'll look to do instead in the future is to provide guidance. That way it's clear this is the rule text and the requirements, and the guidance is a separate document that kind of helps you apply these requirements. The clear space adjacent to passenger loading zone, we have the same requirement. That's center 50% at adjacent to accessible passenger loading zones needs to be clear. So same thing applies, similar to on-street parking spaces. In the proposed rule, we did have a requirement that you have signage at accessible passenger loading zones. We have removed that. So there's no signage required at accessible passenger loading zones. So those are the main changes. There's a few other things that I want to note, some other changes we made. In the draft rule, we talked about where detectable warning surfaces are required. And then in an advisory, we had a discussion about detectable warning surfaces at driveways. And we had some language on, take into consideration what traffic control you have at the driveway, the volume of traffic at the driveway. So in the final rule, we're more explicit about what's required at driveways. Specifically, pedestrian circulation paths at driveways that are controlled with yield or stop control devices or traffic signals must have detectable warning surfaces. We have added a new requirement for transit shelters and transit stops, and that's for fare vending machines. If you do provide fare vending machines at transit stops or transit shelters, they need to be accessible. And there's some things like vending machines where we've referenced ADAG, because ADAG already has the requirements for what an accessible fare vending machine is. So that's where you see the citation to Appendix D, 36 CFR. That is ADAG. We've clarified ramp clear width. So in ADAG on buildings and sites, the minimum width for a ramp has always been 36 inches. In the final rule, we're clarifying that the clear width of a ramp run must be 48 inches minimum. If you provide handrails, the clear width between the handrails must be 48 inches minimum. And the exception is that when the ramp only serves a building entrance, the clear width of the ramp can be 36 inches minimum, which is consistent with ADAG. So you're going to have to look at what your ramp is serving to determine the minimum width. This is a requirement that we added for visual contrast on stairs. This is one of those requirements that was driven by commenters. There was a lot of people who requested that we add this requirement. So the leading edge of each step tread and the top landing must be marked by a stripe. The stripe must be an inch wide minimum. And it must contrast visually with the rest of the steps. So this picture here kind of shows you what that would look like, having that visual contrast at the leading edge of each step tread. I mentioned at the beginning that my presentation is going to cover most of what has changed, most of what we have revised. But again, if you want in-depth information on every provision and how it's changed, we do have some YouTube videos, and this is a QR code which will also display toward the end of this presentation. And I'll hand it over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Juliet. Great job and lots of good slides. We saw lots of comments in the Q&As about how much people appreciate the slides and would like a copy of them. So we can talk about that later in the Q&A portion. I just want to cover briefly from Federal Highway's perspective. Now what? The name of the webinar, like what's the future for PROWAG? Final PROWAG is published. What does that mean for Federal Highways and for state and local entities? And just to reiterate, the final PROWAG, which is published by the Access Board that Juliet just went over, will not become an enforceable standard until under the ADA, until DOJ and DOT adopt accessibility standards that are consistent with the PROWAG through separate rulemaking procedures. The PROWAG must also be adopted by the General Services Administration before it becomes enforceable with respect to federal lands facilities under the Architectural Barriers Act. And Juliet mentioned both of those, the ADA and the Architectural Barriers Act, or the ABA, at the beginning. When we do that rulemaking, there were a couple of questions in the chat pod or the Q&A pod, there will be a notice of proposed rulemaking published by DOJ and or DOT. That may not happen at the same time, but that notice of proposed rulemaking will include a timeline for compliance, and NPRM, or notice of proposed rulemaking, is put out there for the public to comment on. So when you see that published, if you have comments on the timeline, you think it's too short or too long or whatever, then that'll be your opportunity to submit comments. I can't tell you what the timeline would be yet because I don't know. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 sets forth a two-step process for the adoption of accessibility standards. And this is sometimes confusing to people. The first step is the ADA directs the U.S. Access Board to adopt minimum guidelines for the accessibility of applicable facilities. The Access Board completed that step in August 2023 for pedestrian facilities in the public rights-of-way. The guidelines are not enforceable under the ADA at this point. Second step is the ADA directs DOT and DOJ to adopt accessibility standards into their respective ADA regulations that are consistent with the board's minimum accessibility guidelines. It is only after the DOJ and DOT complete their separate rulemaking processes that the board's minimum guidelines become enforceable federal standards. DOT has announced in our spring 2023 regulatory agenda that we intend to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking to adopt the PROWAG into our regulations in 2024. It's difficult to provide a timeline for completing this process. In the meantime, people and agencies should be aware that DOT and DOJ regulations adopting standards for the accessibility of pedestrian facilities in the public rights-of-way must be consistent with the Access Board's final PROWAG rule, and that the board's final PROWAG rule, while not yet enforceable under the ADA, establishes minimum guidelines for accessibility. So now we know what the minimum guidelines are, and when DOJ and DOT adopt proposed rules to adopt a federal standard, it'll have to be consistent with the Access Board's guidelines. There are three paths to adoption, each with a different authority and applicability as set forth in the law. DOJ, under the ADA Title II, has authority over most pedestrian facilities in the public rights-of-way, regardless of how those projects are funded. So they could adopt PROWAG as a standard under the ADA. DOT could adopt PROWAG as a standard under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which gives DOT authority over most pedestrian facilities in the public rights-of-way, but only applies to recipients of federal financial assistance. And the DOT, any rulemaking by DOT under Section 504 requires DOJ review and approval of any proposed regulations. DOT under the ADA Title II has direct authority that's applicable only to public transportation facilities in the right-of-way. So transit stops, for instance. Until DOT and DOJ adopt accessibility standards for pedestrian facilities in the public rights-of-way, public entities have some degree of flexibility in determining how they will comply with the general obligation under Title II of the ADA to ensure that their facilities are accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. That's a requirement of the law, whether there's standards or not. Public entities are not required to adopt the final PROWAG at this time, but they may turn to different resources for guidance when determining how to ensure accessibility, including the final PROWAG, DOJ's 2010 ADA standards for buildings and sites, for guidance on similar issues that arise in the public right-of-way, or other accessibility resources. So that's where things stand, and turn it back over to our moderators.
Okay, thank you guys so much. So much information that we're sharing with everybody. And so I want to give it to Autumn for just a second. She's going to do a quick poll on our attendance, and then we'll start our Q&A session.
Thank you, Marianne. I'll just launch this poll really quickly. If everyone could fill that out just for a moment. Okay. Looks like that may not be working, so I'll launch it again here in a moment. You can go ahead with the Q&A, Marianne.
Okay, great. I did see a lot of results coming in, and it seemed like there was some pretty nice groups of people, which we really, encourage with our webinars is for people to, especially, congregate with your coworkers, so that I'm sure you're going to have lots of discussion and questions about all this information. So it's good to see that there's some groups that are participating. To kind of start with the questions, there is a lot of questions. And both Melissa Anderson with Federal Highway and Elizabeth Hilton have been really busy answering questions. But let me go up, and I've been kind of scanning through to see which ones would be most useful for you. Let's see. So one person writes, is it safe to assume that in situations where curb ramps are constructed, but there is, or to be constructed, but there is limited right-of-way with adjoining private property, the design of the curb ramp would be designed to the maximum extent feasible, using the adjacent development facilities as the existing physical constraint? I think that's really for you, Juliet. So.
Yeah, I think it's very much a case-by-case basis on what the limitations are with the adjacent facilities. And again, I think maybe this is also pointing to us eliminating the right-of-way availability as an example. And enforcing agencies, once they adopt, will probably provide more guidance in terms of that. But I wouldn't just automatically assume that I would have to go out of the right-of-way to make this fully compliant, so I don't have to do anything. So I think you just really need to look at each project on a case-by-case basis and what you're doing overall on that project. So it's not a clear answer. Every project's going to look different.
Okay. And maybe in the design phase, you should really anticipate these curb ramps and even think about a small right-of-way phase that would include a corner clip or something. There's ways to get around the constraint at the corner. Let me see. There was a really good question here. This relates to sidewalk width and the pedestrian access route. Does the width of the PAR always exclude a shy width from top face above the road gutter? In other words, with monolithic sidewalk poured without a separate curve and joint, does the PAR width include the entire width of the monolithic facility?
So you want to make sure you're not counting the gutter part into the minimum 48 inches.
Yeah, and these would be
right? Because,
and they're starting to kind of do this where there's no curb. There's just a slab. So.
Right.
I think that's the question. Does the 6 inch, we said don't include the top of curb in the width, but if there's no separate curb, should you still kind of count the 6 inch offset from the face of curb before you start your 48-inch measurement, even if
Right.
there's no joint.
Yeah, no, we don't require that. We don't require you to have a 6-inch offset.
Okay, but it
Yeah.
might be.
We just want to
small.
make sure you're not counting the curb as part of that pedestrian
Okay,
access route.
okay, thank you. Let me see. Oh, for this was for R309, 1.3.2. This was boarding and alighting areas. Do all the boarding and alighting areas need to comply? And this is relative to the bus, you know, that it might have multiple entrance and exit points, or just the front door?
So you need to have a boarding and alighting area for each entrance or exit.
Okay.
Yeah.
And oh, one big change that I noticed between the draft and final rule was removal of the figures. Was there a reason these were removed in the final rule, and is an alternative resource available?
So the first thing I want to point out is language is always what's enforceable, not figures. The other thing is, because we revised the rule text, some of those figures aren't accurate anymore. And we did have some figures that had some errors on them. So we do intend to provide some illustrations in the rule text, and you'll see that on our website. But I really do want to emphasize, and we hear you, and we have received that request, and we are working on those, on adding some figures. For example, that 50% center clearance on the parking, you'll see that in there. But I do want to emphasize that it's the rule text that governs, not the figures, but we will provide some figures, and we'll provide other guidance on the rule text. And those are things that we're definitely working on.
Okay. This question came in and it really was related to shared use paths, but I can see that it might even relate to sidewalks. So if you have an existing facility and there's construction going on, and the temporary facility is going to be built, does it need to maintain this? Does the temporary facility need to provide the same width as the initial facility, or is there some minimum width that would be allowed?
So we do provide in the requirements a minimum width pedestrian access route, basically, or at least consistent with the existing.
Okay, so what about like for a shared use path? Because there's not criteria for the shared use path width, only that the entire path should be accessible. So what about if you have a 12-foot wide shared use path, but your temporary path might only be 8 feet wide? Would still be considered accessible?
That would be considered accessible. Again, when you're providing alternate pedestrian access route, a lot of times there's, technical and feasibility issues, just finding where to have that alternate pedestrian access route. And while, yes, we do require the full width of a shared use path to be accessible, it's understandable that the alternate may not be as wide, because you just may not have an alternate space to provide that. So that's definitely something that that we're sure is going to happen. It's kind of based on existing physical constraints.
Okay. There's a lot of questions that ask if the slides are going to be available. And I know there's a lot of resources if you follow the QAR code on the screen to the Access Board's website. Is there anything else you'd like to add about that?
Yeah, but you guys can have the slides. You can email me and I can send them to you, or maybe they can get them through APBP, because I did send you guys copies of the slides. And we do have resources. We do have the 5 YouTube videos. If you're familiar with PROWAG, you've been working on it. There's one video, the last video, that really covers the changes. Probably can just focus on that one. And then also we're looking to go out there and do some in-person training. We do have a limited staff, so we won't be coming to every town. I think we'll probably focus first primarily on maybe the bigger conferences or bigger audiences. So while we may not travel to come train 25 people, we may come to a conference that has, an audience of 1,000. So
Okay.
there's different things that we're working on. But with the limited staff, some of it is going to take a little longer to get out there. We are trying to see if we can develop a comparison chart between the draft rule text and the final rule text. So we're putting out a lot of resources as we develop it.
Okay. Let me see another one. Thank you. And let me see. There's a question about the audible notification requirements at signals. If they ask that you expand on that just a little bit, is there anything else that you'd like to add beyond what you had in your slides?
Really, the overarching requirement is that information that you're providing to a sighted individual should also be provided to someone who's blind or low vision. There's a lot of different detail. I touched on if it's a walk indication versus just an information. So it's kind of a lot to it. And again, I couldn't cover more in depth in this limited time, but if you have very specific questions, feel free to reach out.
Okay. And I just want to put a plug in actually for the technical assistance portion of the US Access Board. They're so able to work through your problem and to explain a solution for you that makes improving the pedestrian environment so much more accessible. So I encourage people to call the Access Board technical assistance. They're not going to take your name and check your project later. They're really there to help you. So to encourage you to do that.
Marianne, just to add, email works great too. We do have a specific right-of-way email, row@access-board.gov. So that's another way, especially if you have a project and you have, whether it's plan sheets or something along those lines that might be helpful in answering your question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, email is really the best way to catch us. We all are out and about, especially I love the fact that you guys are getting out and doing so much training on this now. So let me see. Lots of push button questions. That's a really hard topic. There was a person who wrote in, and it's not really an accessibility question, but for bicyclists and detection of bicyclists, the agency they were talking with encouraged them to use a push button that they installed specifically for the bicyclists out of the roadway. And I just wanted to add that, there are loops that detect bicyclists. So work with your agency a little more. It is possible without having to use a push button. Okay, with ramps at the apex of a radii, can you clarify the orientation of the detectable warning strips?
So the detectable warning is always required to extend the full width of the curb ramp. And so it's essentially going to orient in pretty much the same manner as the curb ramp. So just because you have a diagonal curb ramp at the apex doesn't change the orientation of the detectable warning surface.
Okay, I've seen a lot of times where people misunderstood and they line it up with the crosswalk rather than in the ramp, than with the direction of the ramp itself, which kind of made a mess sometimes. Just to be complain about it. For a crosswalk at a roundabout that is signalized, does the cross slope need to conform to that of a roundabout or that of or that of a signal? I don't quite understand the question, but maybe is that more related to the running slope of the roadway?
So at roundabouts, we treat them like mid-block crossing in terms of the cross slope requirement. I think that's what they're asking.
Okay.
At mid-block and at roundabouts, that cross slope can match the grade of the road.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Let me see if I can pick a really good one. Okay, this is edge detection. Does the edge detection requirement in 304.1 apply to pedestrian pathways that are adjacent to bicycle paths?
No, and that's definitely a concern where you have shared spaces or spaces that are not separated for, between bicyclists and pedestrians. There's definitely some concerns there, but it's not. That's not addressed in PROWAG. PROWAG doesn't provide any guidance on separation of bike lanes from the pedestrian access route.
Okay. I just, saw a webinar just very recently about some research into types of separation using tactile warning strips and things like that. But it seems to be still in research and not yet decided what's the best treatment. So let me see. Okay, I think a lot of these are very specific to projects. For private driveways with stop yield signage not regulated by the municipality, would tactiles still be required?
We don't get into who regulates it. If you put it there, you need to provide a tactile warning service.
That would be a hard one. Let's see. What is considered infeasible for the 10-foot separation for push buttons that can allow push buttons on the same pole?
That's really project specific. I mean, there could be, I don't know, utilities, existing developed facilities. There's a whole list of things that could be at issue. So that's really very project specific.
Okay. All right. And I think that's all the questions we have time for. The webinar is being recorded, so it would be available to you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Autumn to close us out.
Thanks, Mary Ann, for moderating today. And thank you to our speakers, Juliet and Elizabeth. Once again, we want to recognize and thank all of our sponsors for supporting the APBP webinar program. And thank you for attending today. We'd love to hear your feedback on the webinar. So there will be a brief survey that'll pop up in your browser at the conclusion. If you don't mind completing that, we hope to see you again later this month on our November webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you all.